Hello? Hi everyone, this is Isabel from the China-Britain Business Council. It's great to have you all on the line today for the CBBC webinar with Lord Grimstone. Before we begin, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping items to mention. Please note this session will be recorded and a private link will be made available to members post-event. If possible, just before we begin, it's possible for all attendees on the line to edit your display names so we can see your full names and, if possible, your affiliation. This will help us see who's on the line. Then, during the session, we may also ask members on the line to answer questions from the Minister. Should we call on you to answer, we will request access to your microphone and a dialog box will pop up on your screen. If you're happy to answer, please accept the request and then answer the question briefly. Your microphone will then be muted again. Should you prefer not to answer, simply refuse access and we will look to another member. We will begin the webinar shortly. Hi everyone, thanks again for joining, and we're just about to begin the webinar. So if you didn't hear already, this session will be recorded and a private link will be made available to members post-event. This is a reminder, if you can, please do change your display name to just show your full name and, if possible, your affiliation so we can see who is on the line. You may be asked to answer questions from the Minister during the session. Should we call on you to answer, we will request access to your microphone and a dialog box will pop up on your screen. If you're happy to answer, please accept the request and then answer the question. Your microphone will be muted again. Should you prefer not to answer, simply refuse access and we will look to another member. I will now hand over to the Chair of CBBC, Sir Sherard.
Great. Well, thank you, Isabel, and thank you above all, Lord Grimstone, known to most of us as Jerry, or I see on this call as Lord Jerry, who has agreed to speak to us for, I think we've got just under an hour now. We're very honoured to have you for all sorts of reasons. Jerry began his career in the Treasury as a high-flying official, running the privatization program in the early years of the Thatcher government. He then went to one of the most distinguished merchant banks in Cheapside, J. Henry Schroeder Wagg, and from there has had a very distinguished career in the city, chairing Barclays Bank, Standard Life, and a lot else, the China Market Access Group. And we're very, very proud and privileged and pleased to have someone as Minister for Investment who is not only business capable, but policy capable, who understands how Whitehall works, who understands how China works, and who understands business. So thank you very much for agreeing to this meeting with us, one of your first engagements as a minister. We should congratulate you on your introduction yesterday into the House of Lords, a rather historic occasion, or in fact, I think it was on Monday, you were introduced on the first day of the new virtual session. So thank you, Jerry, very much indeed. And now I think I'm handing over to the advocacy leader, director of CBBC, Andrew People, who's going to lead a conversation, unless Matthew, our chief executive, wants to say a word or two quickly first.
I will come in later, Sherrod, because I have about 10 minutes of prepared content, the sector overview, which Lord Grimstone has requested. So I think it would be helpful if the Minister could now give us his introductory remarks.
Right, okay, thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to Sherrod for those typically generous remarks to welcome me. As you can imagine, I'm having to get used to both being called a minister and a lord. So if any of you call me Jerry, I won't at all be offended by that, and I'll probably respond to it more quickly. Of course, the good thing is I know many of you personally, and as many of you will know, I've had a very long connection with China, which I'll come to in a moment. I should perhaps start just by saying a few words about what my job is and what my role is. I am the Minister for Investment, and I am the Minister for Investment both in the Department of International Trade and in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And I think it's the first time that there's been a minister appointed to this role who spans those two departments. And in my own words, I see the job quite simply. It's to attract investment into the United Kingdom, and I take a very wide definition of investment, both traditional FDI investment, portfolio investment, and fund investment. So it's to attract investment into the United Kingdom. It's to keep in touch with and to help look after at a ministerial level those people who have invested in the United Kingdom. It's a two-way job. My role also is to help UK companies and companies based in the UK invest overseas. I'm the government spokesman on trade policy in the House of Lords, which also means that I have a central role in trade policy and related matters going forward. Perhaps the good news for people on this call is that I've had a very long association with China, gosh, going back nearly 30 years now. I was counting up the other day through some old passports, and I think I've made nearly 300 visits to China over that time. And most latterly, I was chairman of a large insurance joint venture in Tianjin in China. And I have the honor of having chaired 70 consecutive board meetings in Tianjin. And I doubt if there's anybody else on this call who could speak to a similar record. So I start from a position of feeling positive towards China, and positive towards China in terms of the mutual advantage that this country gets together with China from investment in China, investment from China into the UK, and the advantages that UK firms get from both investing in China and exporting to China. We all know, and this is not a call where we're going to get deep into the politics. We know that everything in China on both sides gets associated with politics, but one of my jobs is to look through the politics and to help the people on this call create a successful business in China. It's very clear I think to make clear from the outset, because this sometimes gets lost in the present noise, is that China is an important partner for the UK, and it's seen as an important partner, not just at my level, but with the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and other senior ministers. So I am in no way a lone voice in that. Of course, I perhaps should have started the call by making a reference to the terrible times that we're living in with the pandemic. And I know there's nobody on this call who has not been affected by the pandemic. And I'm sure some people have been very deeply and seriously affected by having lost loved ones in the pandemic. And of course, we should all extend our utmost sympathies to those. Whatever the causes of the pandemic and however it's going to unroll over the next few weeks and months, I think we all recognize that the world is going to look very different after the pandemic, once it starts, this initial impact starts subsiding, to how it looked before. And one of my roles is to help position the United Kingdom in that new world. And it'll be the first time that we've ever faced in the world the need to recapitalize the whole globe simultaneously. We've been used to country recaps, we've been used to company recaps, we've been used to sector recaps, but we've never been used before to something which affects the whole world. That is going to lead to a change in our lives, but also, perhaps most importantly for the purposes of this call, it's also going to lead to a change in investing and trading relationships. People who had access to investment funds before won't necessarily be the same people who have access to them afterwards. People's investment and trade priorities won't necessarily be the same after the pandemic as they were before. And I'm already thinking about, and a subject that I would love to touch on during this call, is what are CBBC members' views of the future? How are they going to be preparing themselves? And what do they see as both the opportunities and the difficulties that we're going to have to face in widening and deepening our commercial relationship with China going forward? That's perhaps enough from me for just a few introductory remarks, because I would like to leave as much time as possible on this call for discussion and a two-way dialogue. So perhaps I can hand it back now to, I think, to Matthew, and then we can get into the meat and substance of this call. And thank you everybody for joining this afternoon on this call.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister, for those introductory remarks. They helped set the scene very well indeed. Now, next on our agenda, we have a roughly 10-minute slot where the Minister has asked me to set the scene, as it were, for our dialogue today by going through sector by sector the current situation with trade and investment exchanges between the UK and China, with particular reference to the impact of COVID-19, how that's affecting our members, and what responses have been made already and might be necessary and appropriate going forward. It's necessarily going to be a bit of a canter around the course. I don't think time will allow me to get too far into the weeds, but Minister, do feel free to come back in and stop me if this is getting too detailed for you. Before we hand over to Andrew, who's going to have a Q&A session with you. Now, we're in a very strange phase. Clearly, the majority of our members in the UK, at least, are still in working from home mode, and CBBC has been endeavouring to respond to that unique situation by delivering in a new way. We have webinars such as today's event, which have had a very good take-up, but we're also seeking to deliver virtual trade missions. We are launching a series of digital China business clinics to provide one-to-one advice, and we are looking to take our annual China business conference online in a digital format as well. And I think in a similar way, all our members are having to think creatively about new ways to respond to the emergency and to keep the show on the road. I think in going through it sector by sector, it makes sense to start with automotive and technology, because those were the two sectors most immediately affected, as sectors very heavily focused on Wuhan, where the outbreak began. Wuhan is a very important logistics center, as you all know. It's both on the key north-south rail route and the east-west Yangtze River route. And it's an important centre for the automotive industry and for technology, particularly chips, semiconductors, and so on. And both those sectors have seen a decline, significant decline. First of all, in terms of supply, there have been very significant disruptions to supply chains, and we may hear more from that from our members in the Q&A. But there's also been a drop in demand, both consumer confidence dipping down very significantly in the short term, but also companies working through their inventories, selling off their inventory, and therefore ordering less. And a dip too in innovation, with product development cycles being delayed and investment decisions being delayed. If we turn to the tech sector specifically, I mean, it's a mixed picture. Funding, we hear from members, has taken a direct hit, with venture capital investment in the tech sector shrinking by 31% in the first quarter. The leading Chinese tech firms, well-known names such as Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, Huawei, have all been very actively involved in adapting and rolling out technology in response to COVID-19. And at CBBC, we feel there are definitely opportunities for UK businesses to learn from what has happened in China in terms of deploying innovation to tackle the crisis. China has also accelerated its investment in 5G, dare I say, as part of a wider stimulus package. And perhaps we shouldn't draw too direct or too explicit links, but there are perhaps lessons there for the UK to learn in terms of its own 5G rollout. In any case, CBBC has been engaging with our members, with our partners such as Alibaba, to help deliver events. We've delivered EdTech online training to Chinese users, and we're working to see how we can accelerate digitization, not just in our own services, but how we can put UK businesses in turn with on long-term opportunities, for example, in the enterprise software space. That's probably enough about the tech sector. Let me move on to the consumer sector, which is one of the busiest for CBBC, certainly in recent years, where we've been delivering export wins on behalf of DIT. A lot of those have come from the consumer sector. I'll break it down first into retail, which took a very big early hit and is now gradually recovering. We're seeing huge potential for growth now as we come out of COVID, especially in health and beauty retail. But more broadly too, McKinsey have done a survey which shows that 48% of respondents in China are confident that consumer spending is picking up. That might seem like quite a low number, 48%, but the equivalent figure for the UK is only 23%. Government in China has been taking an active role, particularly at the local government level, in providing digital vouchers to consumers to fuel the pickup, and that is bouncing back. There may be some long-lasting impacts on consumer behaviour, but on the whole, it seems to be a positive picture. Consumers prioritising product safety, eco-friendly, sustainable brands, and products that help them pursue a healthy lifestyle. And these are all areas where the UK has traditional strengths. Food and drink sector too. I mean, as many of our members will know, China's grocery market is the second largest in the world after the US. Chinese consumers take food safety very seriously, and Britain trades on provenance, premium quality, high food hygiene standard products. We're seeing opportunities now to sell those products through e-commerce, cross-border e-commerce, but it's a very fast-paced market, and updates to regulations in this space are no different. So we need to be nimble and ready to respond to the trends. Creative industries too, and this is an important aspect of the consumer sector. I think we need to split it here into two areas. Those where there are physical presences is really important. So live music, theatres, museums, galleries, the experience economy, if you like, very hard hit, with many venues forced to shut. And while China has begun to recover in this sector from COVID-19, local governments are nevertheless having to push very hard to stimulate the economy, for example, through injecting funds into the development of cultural districts. And then we have the creative industries who are able to develop and deliver a virtual offering. And that includes primarily the games industry, which has got very, very strong demand. And it's a challenging sector, but nonetheless, we're seeing big take up of demand for new computer games. Members typically need help in getting approval. There are concerns in the regulatory bodies in China that youth are spending too much time playing computer games. So the focus there is to encourage the import of high quality proven products. I think this digital delivery model too is relevant to some of the physical venues I talked about earlier. We're seeing the Tate, the British Museum, the V&A and so on, all doing great work in developing virtual experiences for their venues. I'll move on to education next. A very hard hit sectors, many universities and schools concerned about the potential impact on entry for the new academic year in September. And this is a hugely important sector for the UK economy, as you will know, something like £7 billion coming in each year from international students. Universities are moving teaching to online delivery. Most have done that very fully, with pre-sessional English language courses also being delivered online, and more flexibility in terms of which English language tests are accepted for the purposes of those courses. I think most members are working on the basis that lockdown will be lifted in time for face-to-face teaching to resume in September, but some are delaying start dates already, taking the decisions to delay those to October, November. And I think that the hardest hit in this sector are the language schools, where there is big demand normally for short-term language courses over the summer, and clearly many of those are not going to be able to take place. I'll move on to the energy and infrastructure sector. China is a very big producer, big consumer rather, of UK energy products. Over 51% of Britain's energy exports went to China last year. This is not so much physical oil and gas, for example, although that is a very hard hit sector, but kit and services associated with the energy sector. And there's a strong focus currently on the new draft China energy law. This has been released as a draft by China's National Energy Administration, and we're working with members to prepare a policy submission for the National Energy Administration, who called for submissions as part of that consultation and public opinion. Healthcare life sciences, potentially set for significant growth on the back of COVID-19. Certainly demand for medical protection products is increasing, disinfection related products and medical devices, as well as drugs. So-called e-medicine or telehealth is booming. At the start of February, WeDoctor, which of course is a Chinese platform, received more than 92 million, I'll repeat that number, online visits. So we're working to help members to respond to that kind of opportunity. And finally, financial services. I mean, I won't say too much about this because this is very known well to you, Minister, but I mean, businesses are adapting quickly to the situation. We didn't mention in the introduction your role with CMAG, the China Market Access Group, which is an important part of CBBC's engagement for this sector, but there is some thought that we will need to engage in a new way as we come out of COVID, and perhaps the focus will be less on pushing China for regulatory changes or greater market access, that maybe we'll be looking instead on a stronger theme of partnership and working together to identify and develop new commercial opportunities. There we are. I think I'm in danger of overrunning, so I think I will leave it there and hand over to my colleague Andrew People, if that's okay. And Andrew is going to lead you in an interview, as it were, to get into more details and questions on some of these subjects.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Matthew. And
thank you, Matthew. Thank you, man. And can I just mention, I've got a couple of colleagues on the call with me, led by Richard Byrne, who many of you will know as Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner in China, supported by Mohib or Nicholas. So if you ask me any particularly difficult questions, you can imagine who I'll be turning to for an answer.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And thank you once again for your time. I'm sure many of our members will be pleased to hear that you have you come into this job with a positive attitude towards trade and investment relations with China, particularly at this time. Could I ask, just to start off with, you talked about your extensive experience or extensive business experience in China. What did you learn about doing business in China through all of those years that you've been engaged with the country? And furthermore, what did you learn about China's attitude towards Britain as a trade and investment location?
I think I would call out, first of all, the importance of personal relationships. They're important everywhere, but I think even more so in China, and the need to establish warm relationships, establish trust, I think is very important. One of the questions I was often asked by my Chinese friends, because of course, if you look at a map of the world in a Chinese schoolroom, Britain is a tiny little island in the top left-hand corner of the map. And my Chinese friends would often say to me, how did somewhere so far away from the center of the world, i.e. China, manage to exert such influence over the years? And I think China has got a genuine admiration for the UK. Our entrepreneurialism, the fact that we are so adept at reaching out to other nations. So I think it's a partnership that is very easy to forge, but certainly, as come back to my starting point, as far as the members of CBBC are concerned, and I think, by the way, the council does a fantastic job in China-UK relationships, it is the ability to forge personal relationships with your counterparts in China, which I have found so important over the years.
Thank you for that. Now, you'll be aware, of course, that you're coming into this job at a time when there's obviously a lot of criticism of China growing in our own domestic media, and calls for the government to reassess our relationship with China. The Foreign Secretary, of course, the other day said in his daily press conference that there could be no return to business as usual once the pandemic is past. Could you explain more broadly what you see as the government's approach towards China? What you see it as being at this time?
Certainly, look, I think it's always been the case that China excites strong emotions in people. And it excites strong emotions both on the positive side and on the negative side. Hardly anybody is neutral towards China. People have opinions towards China in the same way that people in China, of course, have opinions about countries in the West. I think the pandemic has come as a huge shock to the world, but of course it's come as a huge shock to China as well. And I'm sure, you know, many nations in the world will be asking themselves questions about how did this pandemic occur? Could we have done more to stop it? How can we stop this happening in the future? But I'm a firm believer in thinking that it's going to be constructive relationships between nations that will enable us to answer those questions going forward. And I think that, you know, China will want those questions asked and answered as much as anybody. So I think there, you know, as always in life, you have such a tremendous global shock as this. It's bound to cause perturbations, but I think our role, the people on this call, is to help others, to help colleagues, to help others look through those short-term factors and come back to the, you know, really important question that the advantages to both UK and China of having a constructive relationship going forwards.
Another complicating factor in UK-China relations in the last few months, the last year or so, has been Hong Kong. And again, we saw some arrests of leading activists in Hong Kong over the weekend. How problematic is that at the moment in terms of UK-China relations?
Well, look, I'm proud to be a Hong Kong permanent resident. I lived in Hong Kong for more than 7 years. I feel very at home in Hong Kong, and I have many friends in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is part of China, and it's part of China through an international treaty. It doesn't mean that people in the UK can't have views on what happens in Hong Kong. They're perfectly entitled to that. But the question I've asked publicly in the past is that Hong Kong is part of China. And I think the question for people going forward is the reason many of us invested in Hong Kong and lived in Hong Kong was we saw Hong Kong as a gateway to China. So I'm very strongly of the opinion that constructive relationships between Hong Kong and China, Hong Kong being part of China, aren't just important to Hong Kong and China, they're important to all of us who have lived in, invested and worked in Hong Kong. I don't want to comment on the circumstances of individual cases. I don't think it's the time and place for me to do that. But I just long for the moment where matters between Hong Kong and China are settled, are stable, to the benefit of people both sides of the border in Hong Kong.
Well, as another ex-resident of Hong Kong, I welcome those sentiments as well. Perhaps on a more positive front, obviously, was the Huawei decision earlier this year. Seems like a lifetime ago now, but the decision to allow Huawei to operate in building 5G networks in the UK. That was a move that was obviously welcomed very strongly by us at the CBBC. But of course, as we move through this pandemic period, there have been more voices within the Conservative Party itself calling for a reversal of that decision. Is there any chance at all that you see that the decision could be reversed? What is the current thinking and situation on the Huawei involvement in 5G?
Well, look, I had the great pleasure last summer of going to Shenzhen to meet Mr. Ren and to be taken around Huawei. And anybody who has been to visit Huawei on its campuses in China cannot fail but to be impressed by them. You know as well as I do, there was very careful thought given in all branches of the UK government before coming to the decision that they came to about Huawei earlier this year. I think it was the right decision. I think it was a grown-up decision to come to, both for practical reasons, but also for very important reasons of relationships between China and the UK. Of course, there's certain aspects of activity where we have to look to our national interests in the same way that there's aspects of activity where China has to look to its national interests. But I think those are well understood. Coming back to what I said a few moments ago, many people have strong opinions about China, and I respect people's opinions about China. I think we took the right decision about Huawei. I think that unless there is some profound change in technical or commercial circumstances, I don't see what the grounds are for revisiting that decision, which was taken after a lot of careful thought. I think it was an important decision. And of course, some of the people who supported that decision most of all were UK telecommunication, sort of companies. And I think it's important to remember that.
Have you seen any kind of positive response coming from China as a result of the Huawei decision so far?
Well, I certainly think that if we had shut the doors to Huawei, there would have been a negative response from China. I know the Chinese ambassador here very well. I think he does an excellent job for his country, representing Chinese interests here. And I think that he would have been, disappointed to see any rollback of, what seems a long time ago now from Mr. Xi's visit here, the China-UK golden decade. But I think we should see this in that wider construct. I think China took encouragement from that. I know the Prime Minister has had very positive conversations with President Xi, and as always in life, there's more to relationships than what you read in the media. And I try to look through the froth of some of these comments to the substance which underlies them. And as I said earlier, I think a constructive relationship between the UK and China is of advantage to both sides.
Now, Minister, you'll be aware, of course, that the pandemic has led to a sharp fall in asset prices around the world, and you're obviously responsible for encouraging investment in the UK, but there will be some people in some quarters who are concerned that that fall in asset prices offers sort of big-pocketed investors from overseas a chance to come in and buy up UK assets on the cheap, as it were. Is that a concern to you? Do you think you'll be able to sort of withstand pressure calling for sort of more protectionism at this time?
Look, I think it has to be a general concern, and I absolutely stress that's not a concern specific to China. If market disruption were to cause assets to be mispriced. And I think a lot of the arrangements that the Treasury have put in place is to help the UK get through these crisis weeks and months so that a level of economic activity is resumed again, which allows asset prices to be priced properly again. Now, the owners of assets, generally speaking, look through short-term crises, and if ever there are exchanges in assets, investments or disposals, they look for the long-term value. Of course, none of us would want to see assets being mispriced during this time, but I'm a fervent believer in two-way trade. I'm a fervent believer in two-way investment, and there's always going to be some, sectors of the UK economy which the government rightly and properly takes a particular interest in. But I believe in free markets. But I believe that free markets work best when there is transparency of data, transparency of asset pricing. So I suppose that's a long-winded way of saying is there will be short-term perturbations in the market, but let's look through those to what is the underlying value of assets going forward.
Can I ask about future trade relations with China? Do you see post-Brexit Britain, do you see a trade deal with China as being something that's on the agenda as a potential priority?
Well, it's not in the first wave. Look, we've already made it clear that our first FTA negotiations will be with, it's establishing the continuity arrangements with the various countries which the EU already has existing FTAs. Then it's the new FTAs for us with the USA, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Agreement. So we have a lot on our plate in terms of free trade agreements. We'll work through those, as fast as we can do. But I'm sure everybody would want, in due course, there to see proper trade relationships with China as we have now. And I'm sure there'll be continued discussions about that going forward.
Where do you see particular opportunities in terms of the UK-China trade and investment relationship? Which sectors are you going to be focusing on, and how are you going to help promote commercial opportunities that some of our members will be interested in China in the coming years?
Yeah, well, certainly. Look, we you always, when you have to start looking at tradable sectors and investable sectors, look for competitive advantage. And where do we see competitive advantage in the UK? We see competitive advantage in tech. We see competitive advantage in innovation. We see competitive advantage in some of the long-established manufacturing firms we have in the UK. I see enormous opportunities from the clean growth agenda going forward, as between the USA and China. Tremendous opportunities in life sciences. Tremendous opportunities in education, as Matthew said at the beginning of this call. But when I say that, it's absolutely not to the exclusion of other sectors. It's easy to think of trade and investment in terms of large multinationals, but we should never forget it's the SMEs throughout this country, which often form the backbone of trade and investment relationships. And in my role, it's as important to me to get those SME trade and investment juices flowing properly as it is to help the multinationals. How am I going to do this? I'm going to do it by being, completely accessible to people. As soon as we start traveling again, as I said earlier, there's nothing better in personal relationships. We have a very fine trade team in China. And I pay huge credit to the work that Richard Byrne and his colleagues have been doing on PPE procurement and other matters over recent weeks. I think they've done a tremendous job, and I think they've developed tremendous relationships. The whole area of life sciences and health is going to be very important going forward. But as I said, I don't think any of us, until we're through these stages of the pandemic, are going to be completely sure what the world is going to look like afterwards. And I'm very interested in hearing from members in the next stage of this dialogue as to where they see the opportunities, because who knows the opportunities best? It's the companies who are trading and investing with China.
Well, thank you so much, Minister, for answering those questions and for being so open. Let's move to that dialogue with our members now, and I'll hand back to Matthew to run that session. But thank you very much for your time again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed. That was great. And as you said, Minister, so now is the opportunity to open this up and to have more of a discursive conversation with the members. And I see this as two ways. So I know you have some questions for members, and maybe they'll be able to put points to you as well. So how would you like to begin? I know that disruption to supply chains is one particular interest that you have, but we can begin the conversation as you see fit.
I think that would be very good, but I'm very interested to hear people's views. We're in the process of creating a new investment strategy for the UK, as well as a new export strategy to take full recognition of this sort of highly changed world. And I'd like to have the views from members as to where they think we should be positioning that investment and export strategy as it affects China. I'd love to hear some real life examples, case studies of where people do see opportunities, and as ever, case studies of where they think the government should be doing more to assist people.
Well, on the question of what should we be doing more of, I see that we have a question in the chat from Duncan Ray. Are we able to activate Duncan's microphone so that he puts his question himself? If that doesn't happen, I will read it out, but I'll just give it a moment. Duncan, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yeah. Hello there. I'm here.
Go ahead, Duncan.
Thank you for having me.
Please say who you represent as well.
Yeah, sorry, but thank you for having me first of all, and thank you for letting me put the question forward. I represent a company called Focus SB Limited. We're a SME manufacturer based in Hastings, and we manufacture high-end bespoke electrical accessories, so light switches, sockets, aimed at a high-end residential and sort of five-star hotel market in the UK, but also into China, Hong Kong, Macau, which has been a big growth area for us over the past 2 to 3 years. So as an SME, we've funded all of this out of our own coffers, so to speak, and for our profits from the UK. What we seem to be really lacking from the UK government is that we attend trade shows in China, for example, the CIIE, Design Shanghai, Guangzhou Design Week, etc. However, the TAP program and the government setup only seems to have any real support for major multinational companies looking at general areas and general trade markets. Doesn't really seem to be any real impetus for small niche manufacturers into this area. I wonder how you see this being addressed after the virus.
Well, look, as I said earlier, I think that, you know, companies like yours are the backbone of our economy. I don't know whether you're in contact with any of our international trade advisors. You know, we've got a network of international trade advisors around the country. They're always willing to offer advice and to help. I think that all of us, and I think there is I'm a great believer in big companies also helping smaller companies. And I think one of the great advantages of CBBC is there's a lot of wisdom and experience in CBBC. And I certainly encourage large companies to do all they can to help smaller companies, both in terms of, you know, supply chains, but also in terms of sharing expertise, intelligence and thought. And I think CBBC has a vital role to play in that. But I think your first port of call is to, you know, speak to one of our international trade advisors. And if you don't get what you want out of them, well, you now know who I am. And look, feel free to contact me directly to do what I can. And if I, in any of my visits to China, see an opportunity to sell a few of your products, take for granted I'll be doing that.
Okay, thank you very much. In response to that, we already have a good relationship with the DIT and the CBBC and work with them both in the UK and China. But on a broader scale, the shows like the CIE for us is a big show where we won a major project in China with one of the airports for fittings, etc. But all of the support is geared towards companies like AstraZeneca, Premier League, and companies like that. And as an SME in a niche manufacturing industry, it's very difficult to get any recognition on a larger scale.
Thank you, Duncan.
Well, we'll try and find an opportunity for you and I to go to China together on one mission one day.
That'd be great. Thank you very much.
we will hold you to that, Minister. Thank you. Let me just encourage members. We're getting a number of questions in the chat, which I will put to the Minister. So do contribute there if that is what you would like to do. Otherwise, I know there are points that are of interest to the Minister, and I may pick on individuals to try and answer those. But I'm going to go to the education sector next because, as I said, that's a very important one. We have He Xiaowei from the University of Northampton, who would like to ask a question about onshoring, the economic impact of all of this in the wake of COVID-19. So, He Xiaowei, are we able to activate your microphone? And
thank you. Just unmuted.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Lord Jerry. That's fascinating talk. Now my question really is, reading the newspapers across the world, that there seems to be some reflections on the supply chain of medical equipment, but also other perhaps products as well. To what extent, my question is, to what extent do you foresee a significant reshoring of supply chain and manufacturing activities back to developed countries as a result of this pandemic reflection?
Look, I think that's a very good question and a very, very important question. Since I've taken up this role, I've spoken to as many companies as I possibly could fit into, 12 hours a day. And there's no doubt that companies will be looking at their supply chains going forward. And I think a common theme that's come out is that some companies will be looking to shorten their supply chains and, importantly, to diversify their supply chains. When everything is running smoothly, one doesn't always look under the bonnet of the engine to see how supply chains work. One just takes for granted that they will carry on working in the way that they always have. But I think this has made people understand the old, wisdom. You can't have all your eggs in one basket. And I don't think that's a matter that's actually is addressed to China or to any other country. So I think there will be repositioning of supply chains. Part of my role will be to, where possible, encourage people to reposition their supply chains in the UK. That would be a great advantage to us. And I think there will be questions people would naturally ask themselves about national resilience. I think what this pandemic has shown many countries around the world is you do have to have levels of resilience. Perhaps not enough attention has been paid to that in many places over the recent years. So I think people will be more conscious of national resilience going forward. They will think where they can either make things themselves or have guaranteed access to things which are crucial to national resilience. So I think there will be enormous thinking done after this. And I think there will be different ways of working, different ways of getting supply chain. I think people will become much more interested in supply chains going forward.
Thank you, Minister. That's great. Time is pressing on, so I'm going to just squeeze in one last question, if I may, before I hand back to Gerard to wrap things up. We have a question from Chris Vitali, who represents the West of England Combined Authority, so a question from local government, and it is about investment, which is of course your portfolio. So could we try to activate Chris Vitali's microphone, please? So
hello, can you hear me?
There he is. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk, very interesting, and thank you for the opportunity. As mentioned, I work for the West of England Combined Authority in the Inward Investment Department. We've been engaging with China on various different fronts, and interest has been, it's not been great, if I'm honest. So I'm just trying to understand how you feel that relationship is going to look. So my question is, do you feel that the the focus of investment is London-centric at the moment in terms of perspectives from Chinese investors? Do you think that UK regions are being recognised by potential investors? And with that, how do you feel that we might be able to position ourselves better? And then with that, a lot of the companies that we've seen, they've come over, they've had a look, they've engaged in conversations productively, but we've not really seen any full commitment. So it seems that that initial conversation happens, there's an interest for trade, but converting that to real inward investment doesn't quite happen. So I'm just curious to see how you feel with that.
Yeah, well, look, and I'm very conscious of that point, and indeed, before I took this role, I've had a number of discussions with Liu Xiaoming, the Chinese ambassador, about the opportunities that there are for Chinese companies in the regions. You're completely right that a visit, a delegation is all very well, but it's what comes afterwards that matters. Yeah. And I think that sometimes people get a bit of a romantic notion about this. They think if they have a delegation come in, you take them out for a meal, you have a glass of wine or a glass of beer with them, somehow something magic will happen afterwards, and there'll be a trade and investment. So exactly. I think the challenge is, you put your finger on the nub of it, is how do you convert those kind of dialogues into something concrete? Look, right. I was taught a lesson in my years as a banker. You might want to sell something, but somebody else has to want to buy it in order to make a successful transaction out of it. And I think it is really pinning down what are the opportunities in your locality, what are the kind of unique propositions in your locality? And that can come from heritage, from manufacturing, it can come from academia in all sorts of ways. And how can you develop those opportunities? Now, I think the good news is that I go back 15, 20 years when I first started operating in China. The only people who did two-way business then were large companies. And what did large companies want to do? They wanted to deal with other large companies in places that they were familiar with. You now have a much, much wider spectrum of companies in China, both in terms of size, in terms of geography, wanting to do business overseas. And I think it is tapping into that more diverse stream of opportunities. I think that on the trade side, e-commerce, of course, gives fantastic opportunities for UK companies. Some of the great, I was talking to Alibaba yesterday, and they're very keen to extend, of course, their trading platforms more into the UK. But I think you have to, to sit down and do call on one of the services of our trade or investment advisors, and to think what it is that you have to offer, then to work out who to offer it to, and then frankly to pin it down. It's all very well if you're fishing, thinking you've caught a fish. You only know you've caught that fish once you've got it out of the water.
Thank you. It is very interesting, and it's one of those things. And I think, to follow up, what do you think it is that will really encourage that initial flow? Is it a case of having a good anchor tenant from a Chinese company? Is it a case of finding that one particular investor that is well known within China, as one example?
I think an anchor tenant is always good. I mean, people will follow where other people have been beforehand. I think it's where you have large manufacturers in your area whose supply chain reaches into China, excuse me, drawing on their contacts to draw them into your area. Familiarity breeds confidence in investment, and it's absolutely how do you extend that familiarity. Which companies in your area are already doing business in China or have Chinese investors? How can you build on that?
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thanks very much for your questions, Chris, and thank you, Minister, not just for that answer, but for all your answers. I have to apologise to a number of people who've raised their hands. Martin, Laura, Rupert, I see you have a question in the chat. Apologies, but we're now nearly at the hour, so I am going to hand over without further ado to our chair, Sir Sherard, who is going to wrap things up for us.
Matthew, can I just say that anybody who didn't have the opportunity to ask a question, if they wanted to email me, that's easy. Grandly, it's lord.grimstone@trade.gov.uk. I'm sure you can circulate that, and people are very welcome to email me those questions. I found this session so useful. If the CBBC wanted to do it again, on a future occasion, or to do some sectoral specific, sessions, I'd always be absolutely happy and enthusiastic to do that.
That's a fantastic and generous offer. Thank you very much indeed. We will be taking you up on that on behalf of our members. And can I say it's a really encouraging and welcome that you are our minister, the Minister for China, in a sense, at DIT, given your extensive knowledge and background. And we will definitely be making the most of you in the months to come. Now, I am looking at my screen to see if we still have Sherard, because I do not see him popping up, in which case I think all that it remains for me to do in closing this session is to thank you once again, to thank all the members who registered and have joined the session. We will be trying to do more of these. We will be looking to do another of these with yourself, Minister, but we realise that we haven't got the format exactly right yet. So feedback is incredibly important. Please do let us know how this session has worked for you all, and we look forward to doing more of these, as I say, in the months to come. There we are. My computer has just popped up and told me that it's 3 o'clock. So unless you have any final thoughts for us, Minister?
No, other than to say I've enjoyed it, and I really mean I'd like to do it again. So thank you, Matthew. Thanks to the team for setting this up, and thanks to Sherrod as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye everyone for now.